We continue here tonight a report by Harvard University's Growth Lab sounding the alarm over the ANC's cadre deployment policy. It warns it could lead to the complete collapse of the South African state. We're joined now by Wits School of Governance, Professor Alex van Der Heever. Prof. van Der Heever, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. So I guess this literature very much falls in line to the various assessments that have been done around the use of the ANC's cadre deployment policy and the extent to which that has or has not been benefiting the state. What do you make of this latest one?
Well, I think it's an accurate assessment of South Africa, and I think the important, and we would be at risk if we didn't take note of it, but I think that this is a realization that many in South Africa have reached. And the sort of central thematic comment that is made is that you could face a sort of a single disaster and recover from that. The problem with the cadre deployment policy and the way in which the BEE framework has been handled is that it generates systemic failures of government. And these systemic failures of government don't go away. And then they have massive knock-on effects. And the argument is we've lost between 30 to 40% of our GDP, and much of our unemployment and inequality can be explained by these policies. And cadre deployment as a policy itself doesn't fit in the South African context and in the South African Constitution. It's a policy that is effectively employed by the Chinese Communist Party in what is in essence a totalitarian society where people are essentially, the government is totally controlled by a single political party. That's not South Africa, and it doesn't work here, and all it's generated is institutionalized corruption and patronage.
What I found quite interesting about this report and sort of what it says in particular about broad-based economic empowerment is that, you know, part of the recommendation is that all preferential procurement policies must be removed, in as much as, you know, there's an incredible amount of criticism around broad-based economic empowerment and how it has been implemented in this country. Do you think that it's something that this country can afford to get rid of completely?
Look, I think there are genuine ways of empowering people. The problem is what has been implemented is not empowerment. It has really generated middlemen who do very little, don't add much value at all, don't grow, don't develop, don't become better, and just outsource the actual work to somebody else and just magnify the cost of very basic functions and services. So what this means is that we get roads that firstly don't get finished. There's all sorts of corruption in the contract itself. But the competence of these companies that are very often paper companies that are set up with one person and a PC are actually supposedly running big projects, but all they are is directing the business back to traditional capable companies. But they're charging their prices to the middleman, and the middleman is charging a markup so they get rich. That's basically what we've seen when things even get delivered. The other problem is that the system has got so bad that you don't actually have to deliver on the project. We're seeing this across the board. It's not one or two instances. It's across the board where essentially loans are being given to companies and they don't have to deliver, and they will get repeated. There will be grants given, payments paid despite work not being completed. Contracts are not supervised. And this is systematic. So, unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that the knock-on effects for the economy, logistics services collapsing, Eskom collapsing, our roads are not being properly maintained, our bulk transport systems are dysfunctional and not working. So we're imposing huge costs on the normal functioning of our economy.
Prof, does that speak, though, to what can be described as a wholesale failure of triple BEE? Again, because when we look at just the private sector in this country and what the numbers tell us about the rate of transformation that has taken place, is that it has been marginal. And, you know, when we have the Employment Equity Commission that sort of track these numbers post-democracy to where we are today, they've been tracking very little progress. So just off of the face of it, what we know is that there is no clear will, including even from the private sector, to transform, despite the fact that there are policies in place that push for that. So is it a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because what is clear is the fact that we do need some ways to make our economy a lot more inclusive than it is right now.
It is absolutely essential, but the problem that we have, and it's pointed out by the Harvard economists, is that the very simplistic model that has been introduced for BEE and quotas, etc., is imposed on a very complex system. All it does is it destroys productivity. And this is aside from the corruption that is a side consequence of this framework. It has just enabled corrupt arrangements to exist, is that we've actually caused the economy to go into decline. Now, transformation works best with a growing economy. And if we lose a third to a quarter of our GDP as a consequence of basically badly implemented and corruptible processes and approaches, you're not going to get transformation. What's going to happen is only relatively strong incumbents, let's say incumbent organizations that can survive this will continue to exist. But those are the only companies then we will have. What we needed to do was expand the economy 3 times. And in expanding the economy 3 times with an inclusive model, we will have systematic transformation across the country. But what we've done is we've basically destroyed value wholesale in South Africa, and it really is putting the whole of South African society at risk, and it has to be looked at very closely. Our transformation model didn't work because it's essentially been driven by individuals who've tried to divert funds to themselves and their friends rather than to actually develop South Africa. That has been prioritized, and the danger is you can't create these loopholes and gaps in the integrity of the public service and the state in order to pursue that goal and assume that you can carry on doing it because it's a noble goal. You've got to do the right thing, the one that works, and the one that works for everybody, not the one that works for the guy who's basically becoming a gatekeeper to projects in the state.
I imagine then part of what you're saying is that we would need an alternative. Because right now, of course, it's one thing to say the system is not working, but to get rid of it with nothing in place means that, the path to transformation is not going to get better, it's going to get worse, despite even the current challenges that we're facing.
Well, one of the problems is that the people who would have to transition the framework that we have are essentially bad actors who've exploited the weaknesses of the current framework and have taken advantage of it. And turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So part of the excuse for not changing is, we need a BEE strategy. Well, we do need it, but we need a different one. And it's quite clear it doesn't work. And it's not going to work with deeper quotas and more destruction of the private sector in South Africa. And there's also a lot of unquantified transformation that has occurred, but it's actually negligible if if our economic development is severely undermined. And we're seeing it now, ships outside Durban Harbour and Cape Town Harbour, all because Transnet has just become corrupt. And Transnet is completely dysfunctional from all aspects of logistics. And the consequence is every part of our economy is affected by that, quite aside from load shedding. And all of these things are now cascading in the economy. And it's important to note that part of this and the gap that was created is the municipal governments that were so corrupt in all of their tenders don't pay their bill to Eskom, which deepens their debt and places a greater burden on any structural transformation of Eskom itself and its rehabilitation. These are the kind of knock-on effects that we have.
You're actually bringing me to my next point, and I'd like you just to keep it brief. Just on the issue of cadre deployment, there, of course, as we've discussed earlier, there's been lots of literature and reviews on the impact of this policy on the country, and I think holistically much of it has, been slanted towards the negative, right? But when we look at what is happening at a local government level, where there has been a change in leadership, where it's not just the ANC that has been charged of local government, we're not necessarily seeing a change or a suggestion that other parties will do differently. Because much of the conflicts that exist at local government level is that political parties want their representatives to be put in certain positions. So is that not going to be a problem that we face, regardless of whether the ANC is in charge?
No, I think that's a narrative that's put forward. We've got in the coalition government in Johannesburg is basically the ANC government plus people with a very close affiliation to the patronage model of procurement and deployment. That's not going to work. It's just added additional parties that do the same thing. The other, in the cases like Tshwane and NMB, when they fall under a different coalition, brittly, with a very brittle majority, which switches over, that's the difficulty that gets created, is they start to attack the patronage and they get overturned. But in cases like Tshwane, the rot has been so deep that to turn around what has become a decade metropole takes huge effort. If you had to look at the functionality of the Western Cape metro, it takes years of constant building of capability to get to a point where you are able to do powerful things in government to achieve improvement. But in the case of Tshwane now, it's survival. The budgets have been wrecked. The neglect of infrastructure is years in the making. And you've got staff that are not necessarily all on board and all rowing in the same direction. So it takes time. You can't just put a single person or an administration and expect it to turn around. And the other issue, which we do have to take into account, is that in some cases there are corrupt interests who deliberately sabotage those particular metros in order to create the narrative. They sabotage it to say, look, it doesn't work when another coalition government is in place. That's just not true. It's very easy to sabotage these metros relatively soon after they have transitioned. So I think that the cooperative governments, the coalition governments that we have are the future, and they will build stability down the line. But I think that as in South Africa, a lot will depend on how electoral politics works out and whether people can actually differentiate between parties who exist entirely on patronage. That's them. They talk about policies, but they're basically built on patronage.
All right.
And building that in. So that you differentiate between those parties and ones which are actually looking at policy. And I think that's going to have to be the thing we look at when we get to the next set of elections. And it can be a coalition government, but people that think the same.
We'll have to leave it there for tonight, unfortunately, Prof. But seemingly next time we need to line you up for half an hour to have this kind of conversation.